Welcome to my second in a series of tours of my favorite place, Death Valley. In this video, I'll be talking about the canyons, playas, Playa Lakes, and alluvial fans of Death Valley. In other words, the work of water. Death Valley, as the hottest, driest desert in North America, receives less than 2 inches, 5 centimeters, of rain a year. Of course, that's an average. Some years it receives none. However, this is California, so when it rains, it pours. In 2015, there were 2 3/4 inches of rain in 5 hours, creating a flash flood in Grapevine Canyon that damaged the roads and Scotty's Castle, a historic site in Death Valley. Flash floods are usually the result of thunderstorms, which can drop heavy rain in a short amount of time. The resulting floods are particularly bad in deserts, where there is little vegetation to slow down the flow. They look nothing like the simulated flash flood of Universal Studio Tour with its nice, clean water. Flash floods are dirty, dangerous, and full of debris. They erode the land quickly, picking up dirt, rocks, boulders, cars, and, in the case of the 2004 flash flood of Furnace Creek Wash, even outhouses. Those outhouses serve the parking lot of Zabriski Point, one of the most photographed sites in Death Valley. Its beauty is derived from its barren badland topography. Badlands are a type of dry terrain where softer sedimentary rocks and clay-rich soils have been extensively eroded by torrential but infrequent rains. This is mudstone, which originally formed at the bottom of a lake. The clay and salt do not allow for any vegetation to grow, so that when it does rain, the mudstone erodes very quickly, forming ravines and gullies. The pointed hill seen from Zabriski Point is called Manly Beacon and is named for William Lewis Manly. In 1849, a group of immigrants looking for a shortcut to the California gold fields ended up in Death Valley. One group of gold-seeking 49ers, the Bennett and Arcane Party, included a family with small children. They were stranded at a spring located directly across the valley for a month, with water available but dwindling food supplies. 2 young men in the group, William Lewis Manly and John Rogers, made a heroic journey on foot of over 300 miles to San Fernando and returned with supplies just before the group perished from starvation. The young men led the party to safety, and as they left behind this deep valley, the site of their long, miserable camp, it is said that one of them proclaimed, "Goodbye, Death Valley." Ever since, it has been known as Death Valley. Why is it known as Manly Beacon and not Rogers Beacon? Well, Manly wrote the book. One of the best places to see the results of flash floods is beautiful Mosaic Canyon, located near Stovepipe Wells. The Tucky Mountains are composed mostly of noonday dolomite, formed by algae in a Precambrian sea 700 million years ago. Dolomite is a carbonate mineral, like calcite, but with magnesium replacing some of the calcium. Like calcite, dolomite is soft and soluble. Mosaic Canyon gets its name from the mosaic-like appearance of breccia, composed of angular pieces of tan dolomite in a matrix of carbonate sand. Here is a view looking down the Alluvial Fan at the end of Mosaic Canyon. Water from a flash flood flows down a canyon, carrying sediment called alluvium. When the flood hits the valley floor, it slows down and drops the alluvium into a fan-shaped deposit. Within that fan, the angular rocks become cemented into breccia. In this picture, you can see the original bedrock, dolomite, and a layer of breccia deposited on top of it. Here is a third layer. The youngest dark layer is deposited on the side of the other layers. This whole process would eventually stop if the mountains weren't constantly being uplifted and the basin downdropped, keeping the slope steep enough for effective erosion by flash floods. One reason that Mosaic Canyon is so beautifully carved and polished is that the noonday dolomite is a very soft rock, while upstream there is sterling quartzite, producing harder quartz debris, which does a great job of scouring and polishing the rock as it flows downhill in a flash flood. If you like Breccia, you should visit Titus Canyon with its Megabreccia. Let me take you a mile above the valley to Dante's view. If you look down, you can see an alluvial fan below. As you can see, it does have a fan shape. The lighter colors represent younger deposits that have not had time to develop the desert varnish that darkens the surface of rocks over time. On the west side of Death Valley, the alluvial fans are much larger, so much so that the separate alluvial fans have combined to form a continuous apron of sediment along the base of the mountain. That layer of alluvium is called a bajada. Here you can see the rugged rock of the mountain, here the bajada at the base of the mountains, and finally the flat valley floor. To the right, you can see one alluvial fan that is part of the bajada. After dropping its large sediment, the water from the flash floods will bring mud and dissolved minerals to the valley floor. The white sediment that you see on the valley floor is salt. This short-lived lake, a Playa Lake, will dry up, leaving behind mud and salts that came from the weathering of the mountain rocks. The valley floor then becomes a playa. Most playa have only mud on their surface, but larger, more long-lived playas like that in the center of Death Valley are an exception. Death Valley has a salt pan. As the Playa Lake dries, the least soluble minerals, like calcite and gypsum, precipitate at the edges. Last to precipitate from the evaporating lake is the most common dissolved mineral, halite, made of sodium chloride, otherwise known as table salt. An excellent place to see the salt pan of Death Valley is at Badwater Basin, the lowest place in North America. If you move away from the trodden path of Badwater, you may come across hexagonal shapes in the salt. As the salt heats and cools, it cracks into these shapes, and salty water creeps up the cracks, leaving the ridges. The white crust is a mixture of soluble minerals, but by far the most common is halite. You could put it on your popcorn. I have been lucky enough to visit after unusually heavy rains, when the Pleistocene Lake Manly once again appears as a playa lake. Because playas are so flat, you can walk long distances without the lake becoming deep. Be careful though, the salty crust and salt water can be painful on bare feet. Another great place to observe the salt pan is at Devil's Golfcourse. Here the slightly lifted crusts of salt weather into chunks with little spires. The wide, flat expanse of the salt flat looks like the set of a science fiction fantasy. I've never heard a good explanation as to why this area is called Devil's Golfcourse, but I have noticed circular dissolution holes in the crust about the size of a golf hole, and I have found golf balls. If you look carefully, some of the crystals are fibrous. Instead of halite, these are ulexite, a borate mineral. Borate minerals such as borax were mined in Death Valley in the late 1800s. To see the remnants of the borax mining operation in Death Valley, you can go to the Harmony Borax Works. Borax is a borate mineral that forms in dry salt lake beds and was such a valuable industrial chemical that it was originally imported all the way from Tibet. In 1881, borax was discovered in Death Valley. The salty crusts were brought to Harmony Borax Works, where they were dissolved in boiling water, and, at the proper temperature, the borax crystals would form on iron rods. The borax was scraped off and placed in wagons. Here you can see the original 20-mule team wagons that brought the borax from Death Valley 165 miles across the desert to Mojave. The wagons would carry 10 tons of borax, 1,200 gallons of water. After 1899, the borax was transported by train. Borax is still being mined in the town of Boron, located east of Mojave. The mine and its visitor center are worth a visit. The borax mining history of Death Valley has become a part of American lore. The first radio western was called Death Valley Days. It was followed by the TV show, first hosted by the Old Ranger actor who was replaced by Ronald Reagan. Reagan eventually left the show to begin his political career. Racetrack Playa is a playa located in a remote part of Death Valley. Most playas have only mud and salt on their surface. Racetrack Playa has a rocky cliff at its southern end, and that cliff sometimes drops rocks onto the surface of the playa, and those rocks are interesting. They seem to move of their own accord, leaving a trail in the dried mud behind them. Only recently the mystery was solved. Once every few years the conditions are just right. The playa fills with water. Because of the high elevation of the playa, the water freezes. The ice starts to melt and break into pieces, floating on very wet, slippery mud. The winds can blow the ice pieces across the playa. If a rock is embedded in the ice, it will move with the ice, dragging along the wet mud, creating a trail. As the ice finally melts and the water evaporates, the rock is left with a mysterious trail in the hardening mud. Mystery solved. Notice that these two rocks left the same trail. They must have been the same piece of ice. Death Valley may be the driest place in North America, but there is water, if you know where to look. Most people who visit Death Valley stay at Furnace Creek, which is a natural oasis. Like many oases, it is there because subterranean water encounters a fault, in this case, the Furnace Creek Fault, and is forced along the fault until it reaches the surface. This is Furnace Creek Inn and Furnace Creek Ranch. Both have swimming pools, and the ranch even has a golf course. Even more unlikely in a desert are the fish living in Salt Creek, a permanently flowing creek that is less than a mile long. Here the groundwater encounters an impermeable layer and is briefly forced to the surface. The water has the same salinity as the ocean and supports a fragile ecosystem of salt-tolerant plants. In the spring, you may be lucky enough to encounter the elusive and endangered Salt Creek pupfish. These tiny fish are a remnant population of fish that lived in Pleistocene Lake Manly, which was connected to other Ice Age lakes. Most of the water has dried up, leaving the pupfish isolated so that they could evolve into a different species from the other pupfish populations in the area, such as these Devil's Hole pupfish. When you think of deserts, you probably don't think of fish, but of sand dunes. The wind features of Death Valley will be the subject of my third video. Meanwhile, don't just watch videos, plan a visit to Death Valley. It's like no other place on Earth. And if you like, download my Death Valley tour found on Amazon and Tours for Mobile so I can go on the visit with you, because I never get tired of visiting Death Valley.